Flug was tired. Extremely tired. In fact, he was so tired that the 3 or 4 viable brain cells that he had left in his spacious dome had gathered straw and provisions, gone into hibernation, and wouldn't be likely to return to active duty much before the next millennium. Or any other gargantuan time span you'd care to mention for that matter. Flug functioned on a timescale that made geological epochs seem a bit hasty, you see. And the fact that he'd been standing on the office roof with his arms in the air for about 5 hours now meant that he'd pretty much had enough when all things were considered. Not that he considered many things, of course. If asked to chew and walk at the same time, he'd probably have a stroke, and then have to pick the food off the bottom of his shoes whilst wondering why he had gravel in his mouth.
"Stitches,"
he said, managing to instill a pleading tone into his deep bass voice.
"Can me stop now?"
The zombie looked down from the chair that he was standing on and pulled a face. Not his actual face, of course, because that would have come off in his hand. So would his hand.
"Just give it a little while longer, big fella. I nearly had it then."
The zombie reached up and carefully adjusted the coat hanger that he'd attached to the bolt in Flug's forehead. This, in turn, was connected via a length of wire to a small black and white television that was sat on the floor next to Flug's feet. At that precise moment, the ancient visual device was displaying nothing except a violent snowstorm, although there were probably adverts still being shown for really useful things like food, who'd have thought we needed that, expensive cars that only a footballer could afford, and drive if he could figure out how to get in it, and Christmas stuff. Well, it is July, you know.
"Just hold still now," said the zombie. "We're nearly there."
About a week ago, Stitches had found the old TV dumped in a bin at the rear of Mrs. Strudel's cafe, and he'd come up with the brilliant idea that if Flug was capable of picking up radio waves, then logically he should be able to pick up a television signal as well. Unfortunately, Stitch's grasp of electronics, visual equipment, and how to utilize them and their various applications effectively was the equivalent of a Roman Catholic priest's understanding of the basic concepts of religion. In other words, he didn't have a bloody clue. Consequently, poor old Flug had spent most of the last 6 days standing on the roof come rain or shine, mostly rain, like a vast meat aerial. He'd also suffered the soul-crushing indignity of having various bits of metalwork stuck to his face in a vain attempt to boost his reception capabilities. Forks, spoons, screwdrivers, hammers, and any other item of kitchen or garage paraphernalia that you'd care to mention had ended up stuck to him at some point over the last week or so. The anvil had been particularly hard work, especially when it had fallen off Flug's head, rolled onto Stitch's foot, and left 3 of his toes looking like 4-day-old porridge. Despite his best efforts, though, it was never going to work, because what Stitches had failed to realize was the fact that Skullenia was in something of a sound and vision wave black hole. For some unknown reason, signals of any description had trouble getting in or out of the village, no matter how hard you, or your equipment, tried. It was bad enough trying to send a text message from one side of the square to the other, let alone the next village over. In fact, it would have been quicker to use a carrier bat. Even quicker if you used a live one. You might as well be trying to get a signal from the outer reaches of the solar system, to be honest. Or on T-Mobile. The chances were about the same.
"Stitches, me tired. Me want sweeties now."
Just as he was about to plead with Flug for 5 more minutes, a crackle and a loud whoosh from above distracted the zombie, throwing his delicate coat hanger array awry.
"Stitches!"
called Mrs. Ladle, as she swooped and arced like a demented swallow.
"What on earth are you trying to do to that poor boy?" "Isn't it obvious?" replied the zombie. "To a mental patient, perhaps," she said, deftly landing on the roof and dismounting, "but not to any sane person." "Well, that leaves—" "Easy now, sunshine," said the witch. "Don't you go taking advantage of my good nature. There's a good chap."
She made a show of checking her pockets.
"I know I've got one somewhere, and it wouldn't take kindly to having someone taking the mick out of it. Come to think of it, I seem to remember it's on my mantelpiece next to my grandfather's eyes and my mother's sense of decorum."
She helped Flug divest himself of several bits of metal and handed him a packet of sweets.
"Oh, fruity flanges, my favourites. Thanks, Mrs. L."
He lumbered off, cramming as many as he could get into his mouth as was inhumanly possible, which was a lot.